fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 28, Nephilim. "Join the Brotherhood," they said. "You'll get to see the world," they said. Hayward chewed on the toothpick between his teeth in anger. His best friend had convinced him to join the clergy with tales of epic battles and glory to his house. But instead, the last 3 years of his service only awarded him with grunt work. There were no heroic deeds, bounties to be plundered, or the unfaithful to convert. Just door duty today. Tomorrow it might be traffic. He reached the next home and banged his fist against the wooden door several times. "Open up, in the name of the scholar!" He waited in silence, yawning as the last remnants of daylight dissolved into dusk. He and the other cadets had been sent out to scour every nook and cranny for some heretic. A few moments passed, and there was no response. He slammed his boot into the wood, kicking in the door and knocking it off its frame. He wasn't allowed to neglect any structure on his route, but if he happened to find anything valuable abandoned in the process, well, hey, call it a perk of the job. His eyes hadn't even adjusted to the dark interior, 1 foot crossing the threshold, when a hand shot out and grabbed him by his shirt. He was ripped off his feet and flew, wide-eyed, across the room before it all went black as he crunched into a wall, slumping unconscious to the floor. "Tragedy! For Pete's sake!" Eric straightened up, moving to where the monk had impacted the wall to inspect the damage. The bricks had been covered in scribbled bits of math that he had hastily scrawled with a piece of charcoal he had found, many of which were now nothing more than a smear. He let out a grunt and turned, gesturing to the wall. "Watch where you throw people!" "Sure. Next time our lives are in danger, I'll aim for something softer, like your head." Theodore bared his teeth at the doctor. "Your maths aren't important right now. The search radius is expanding faster than we can escape." He walked along the dusty floorboards to shove the tip of his boot into the monk's backside. When the figure failed to move, he gave a shrug of his shoulders. "Someone's gonna notice when this one here doesn't report back in. We need to get across that river and to the tower, not scribble in the dirt." "Oh, I'm sorry. Are you smart enough to understand multiverse string theory or the total collapse of superposition interference?" Eric paused for a moment, leaning his head in, turning his ear to the bodyguard's direction. No? Okay then, let me work. We have to survive more than just these religious zealots. The Brotherhood presence isn't as heavy outside the city. If we can just get across... Varyn shifted, tuning out the other 2 men. Glancing out of the open door, he could see the river Teviot from where he sat. The city lay in ruins all along its surface, the water flowing around the crumbled structures and fractured landscape. There were accidental paths, and even a few makeshift ones that bridged the gaps between the detritus that bulged out from the water. Unfortunately, with their luck, they'd be captured or killed before they could navigate the maze it created, with its countless dead ends and scant cover. Theodore snarled in frustration at the doctor's irritating demeanor. He threw his hands in the air and gestured at them with a pointed finger. "Just, stay here. I'm going to try and map us a way across." He turned to leave, but a thought occurred to him. He bent over, plucking up the discarded rifle, and tossed it to Eric. "If anyone walks through this door, just try not to shoot yourself." His face twisted into mock amusement as the doctor clumsily caught the weapon. He detested firearms, and as soon as tragedy had left, Eric gave this one a dark look before setting it on a coffee table and returning to his work. Taking a moment to catch his breath, Herron returned his attention over to the doctor, but it then shifted over to the crumpled figure against the base of the wall. Tragedy had done that without even breaking conversation. He stared after the guard for a moment, and then back to the disheveled and manic man scribbling furiously on the wall. He knew which one was the true danger in the room. Herron dragged his hand down around his mouth as his eyes flitted between his brother and the mad doctor. They were identical, otherworldly twins. He used to fear one and revere the other, but now it was the other way around. He glanced over at Elias, sitting in a corner, swaying back and forth and mumbling to himself. Maybe revere wasn't the right word anymore. Perhaps pity. He needed to get his brother to safety, to get away from Eric before whatever hold Rivaria had on him took root again. The doctor had shifted, turning his back to him to reference some of the equations he had drawn on the floorboards earlier. Only several strides away, the gun sat forgotten on the small table. He could easily confiscate it and escape. Now would be the perfect...
Herron?
The prince jumped at the sound of his name, turning to see his brother mere inches away. How? When?
I found this in my pocket.
His hand fumbled around a small object. Elias winced as pain shot through his head. It was near constant now, like the waves of rippling water lapping against his mind.
I know it's important, but I can't remember why.
He shoved it into his younger brother's hand.
Do you know what it is?
Herron stared into those wandering blue eyes, and then down at the trinket in his hand. He turned over a cracked teal brooch. There was still dried mud in the twisting metal that held the fractured gem. He had seen Pyra wearing this the last time she had visited Oxhand. He had long feared the real reason Elias had cast him to the other side of the country was because of the friendship that had grown between himself and the Queen in the king's absence. His brother had always had a jealous streak, but why did he have this jewel? Herron swallowed hard as realization slammed into him. The last letter he had received from Pyra had been from the Infinite Tower, where she and Elias were attempting to help Eric reach his brother. She was not there when he arrived in the city, and she hadn't been there when the trio had kidnapped him. So, the only reason he would be carrying this...
Oh, did you find another treasure to show me?
Elias attempted to peer over his brother's hand to see what he held, a smile cracking one side of his face.
Please don't let it be another bug.
Herron's face twisted in agony as those words stabbed him in his heart. Before the two of them had been saddled with the weight of their crowns, he and his brother shared everything. Interesting objects they had found, the weird dreams they might have had, or the sweets they stole from the castle kitchens. Treasures to show one another. His eyes burned with the start of tears as the prince shook his head, opening his palm. Elias let out a tiny chuckle, wobbling on the spot.
Oh, good. You know I don't like the bugs you find. Oh, what's that? It's very pretty.
He had forgotten already. His mental state was deteriorating even faster now. This injured man, gripping the prince firmly as if struggling to stay aloft in a churning sea, was his brother, not the boogeyman he had become. Now, more than ever, Herron wanted to find a way to save Elias. He might not have a fully functioning mind at the moment, but the words he said came from the heart. He mouthed his brother's name, but, like always, no words came out. He tucked away the brooch and climbed to his feet. With barely a sound, Herron moved for the rifle. He had never held a firearm before, but he had seen how the soldiers and monks used them. He frowned when he looked over at the doctor, but it quickly faded into astonishment and perhaps a touch of fear. Behind the man, covering almost every inch of floorboards and drywall, was tightly scribbled numbers and symbols. He had to stop this, and now. He raised the weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger, trembling as he tried to press it down, but he couldn't. The sound of movement caused Eric to glance over his shoulder. Seeing that tortured expression on the prince's face belittled the threat of the weapon in his hands. He shot the man a hateful glare before rolling his eyes and returning to his work.
You remind me of my brother. That bleeding heart always lets his emotions think for him. He wouldn't shoot me, and neither will you— Bang!
The kickback from the rifle sent it flying out of Varen's hands, and he was knocked to his backside, his shoulder screaming in pain. His heart was pounding, his hands shaking, but he scrabbled to his feet. It had happened so quick, he wasn't sure where he was aiming.
Oh, you son of a bitch!
Eric was on the ground now, clutching at his calf as an alarming amount of blood seeped between his fingers. Varen twisted, lunging for the weapon once more, but it had skid to a stop somewhere near the open door, and he froze as his eyes landed on a scowling figure standing there, blocking the light. Theodore stepped in, snatching the rifle up.
I gave you one instruction. Don't shoot yourself. How bloody hard is that?
He shot me!
Eric threw an accusatory finger at Varen, flicking blood across the ground. Hiding his smile, Theodore looked at the prince with a raised eyebrow. Varen put the back of one fist against the top of the other and pulled them apart before pointing at his brother.
Nobody here speaks sign language. Now get up and grab Elias. We have to move. More soldiers are on their way. They, may have an idea of where we are now.
He gestured at his own shirt, smeared with someone else's blood. Despite the red splattered across Tragedy's clothing, Eric could only point at his left calf.
I would love to, except I've been shot. You can stay here and get shot more if you'd like.
He dug a hand into a nearby laundry basket and ripped free a length of fabric. Theodore tossed it to the whining man.
It's just a flesh wound. Tie it off and let's get moving. You can practice your cursive when we get back to the tower.
Eric growled but complied. As the other three made their way outside, he quickly cinched the fabric around his bleeding wound. His eyes drifted back to the math. If he was right, and of course he was, they were up to 4 worlds colliding now. Large swaths of each would be imposed atop the already existing landscape, killing more people. And with each additional one, the anomaly would draw others in faster. In another half hour, a 5th would arrive. And after that, he forced himself to his feet, testing his weight on his injured leg. They didn't have time to find this genius kid. He would just have to solve this on his own. I really don't mean to complain so much, especially since we're free and all, but, where exactly are we running towards? Winter dropped into a squat, leaning in close to the others as they huddled out of sight in the protective shadow of a large convoy truck. He peered around the massive tire to see Evan dashing across the street, weaving back and forth between people's legs like a ghost until he ducked into an alley and out of sight. Piper pulled her gaze down from the large clock tower they sat beneath to look at him. You were that slimy guy in the robe. Elias was in that room with Varen, and now they're missing. That means the prince is alive. We gotta find him. I get that. I do, but, Winter glanced around nervously, that paranoia still grinding away just beneath his skin. If them folks in black robes don't know where they are, how are we supposed to find them? So I ask again, where exactly are we running towards? Do we even have a plan?
Evan had scaled up a massive drainpipe to get a bird's-eye view. He squinted among the fancy hairdos and elegant hats, scanning the mobs for any sign of their pursuers. He signaled the all clear and hopped down into the vacant alley, waiting for the others to rush in.
Why do I always have to come up with the plan?
Piper ducked into the alley, jumping behind a large metal rubbish bin and pulling her brother in beside her as a group of citizens ambled by. She shot a look over at the lichen.
How about you try figuring out something for once? I don't know what to do.
Winter winced at the bite in her outburst, taking half a step back. But her lip was quivering, telling him she was holding back.
Listen, if you need to talk, I'm here, all right? The plan?
Evan jumped off the windowsill he had been perched on, watching for a part in the crowds.
Is to escape. That's it. No bells, no whistles. We can't help Vel or Varen if we're captured. So, keep your heads down and follow my lead.
He darted towards the other end of the alley, peering around the corner. He waved them down, hissing,
"Let's go!"
Piper got to her feet and followed the others as they jogged towards the exit. She blinked rapidly several times, refusing to let the tears welling behind her eyes break free. She was angry. No, she was livid and heartbroken. How could Chester feed someone into a meat grinder and then use the word family to justify it?
Piper, it's okay.
She felt the weight of her brother's hand in hers, and she stopped in her tracks. She threw her arms around him and pulled him close, sobbing against his shoulder. Being the older one, always taking care of him, she could honestly say she had never done that before. Atticus patted her back and gave her a squeeze.
It'll be okay. We'll find Prince Varen, and Vel, and Unit 2, and Mom.
She sniffed, pleased that her brother didn't fully understand what was wrong. Piper wouldn't tarnish his image of Chester. The boy lived in a rose-colored world, and honestly, she was glad for it. He didn't have to hurt like she did. She could still remember the first time she had met Chester. His smiling face appeared above her, offering his hand down and pulling her free from the garbage bin she had been scouring for food to feed her brother. Theirs had never been a traditional family, but he had cared for them when no one else had. She owed that man everything. Perhaps that's why his betrayal had hurt her so bad.
Oi, what's the hold-up?
Evan skid to a stop, waving frantically.
We don't have time for all this sentimentality. Those 6 guards and that blonde guy were right behind us. Let's go!
Piper had forced herself to calm, still fighting back the tears, and pulled away from Atticus, patting him gently as she did. Winter stepped up beside her. You know, when the world feels like it's flying out from beneath my feet... He paused, putting one hand on her shoulder and the other on the boy's. You just gotta find something to hold on to. He offered Piper a gentle smile. So, grab on tight and let's put a pin in this. He stepped back as he mimed tacking something to an invisible board. We'll have time enough to unpack this later, but for now, we've got friends to rescue, right? She looked back up at the lichen, blurred by the tears stinging her eyes. He was right. She wasn't ready to deal with this. Maybe she could after finding the prince and Vel.
I keep forgetting how mature you are. Kind of like a wise old owl.
Winter frowned.
I'm 39.
She patted him on the cheek.
Yeah, like I said, old.
He rolled his eyes, but let her have her fun. He could tell it was her way of coping, and Winter could detect the gratitude beneath the snark.
Listen here, you little... Stop right there!
They all turned at the sound of the shouted command to see a man in red barreling down the alley towards them. Evan reacted first and spun on his heel. "Cheese it!" The others didn't need the orders. They were already running for their lives, heading towards the next fork in the labyrinth of back alleys. A cry of fear and a string of curses pulled Piper's attention enough for her to glance back over her shoulder. The soldier, pale as a sheet, was staring down one of the side exits. His hand was lifted, pointing shakily at something they couldn't see. There was a distant screaming, followed by a sound she could only compare to a steam engine. It grew in volume until something massive exploded out of the side street and plowed right into the man, sending him into and then through the opposite wall. Piper's mouth fell open, and one by one the others slowed, curious to see the cause of the commotion. Her heart began to hammer in her throat as through the dust something backed out of the gaping wound in the building. 2 gleaming eyes shone out of the darkness as it turned in their direction. "Oh my God, is that a bear?" Piper screamed as she began to backpedal at the sight of the massive creature, larger than anything she had ever encountered. Well, except maybe Percival. And it was charging down the street in their direction. Evan whooped, leaping into the air. "Barry?" The creature, disheveled and delirious, was half-starved from running for days, relying on magic and willpower to keep going. But as soon as he had hit the city, Barry had caught and followed the scent of his best friend to its source. He could see the Arcanist standing there, staring at him, and he barreled into the group, plucking up his friend into his paws and squeezing him in a tight bear hug. Instinct overrode her fear, and before Piper could give it a second thought, she threw her insignificant weight into the side of the large animal, attempting to pry her brother free from its hold. "Let him go!" Swallowing hard, Winter backed up, preparing himself. His wolf would come screaming out any second to take on this threat. Any second now. Any second. He frowned. I don't think your brother's in any danger." Between the girls' continued shouts and the animals' happy roars, Evan struggled to make his voice heard. He snatched up 2 metal trash can lids and banged them together several times to grab the attention of the others. "Oi, put the kid down. That's not Atlas. And you!" He spun on Piper, tossing the metal lids behind him. "Everything's okay. This is Barry. He's not going to hurt anyone." Piper scowled, ready to argue, when she realized that her brother was laughing, completely uninjured, save for having the air squeezed from his lungs. The bear was licking his face and grunting at him as though he were speaking. With a frown, she slid off the beast and turned back to the tiny dwarf. "The bear's name is Barry?" Finally registering the tiny merc's words, Barry grunted as he stopped, looking at the man in his arms. He blinked. Sure it was Atlas. He sniffed him up and down. No, he didn't just look like the Arcanist, he smelled like him. But his complexion was different, and he had blonde hair. Barry rolled away, dumping the boy on the ground, and scrabbled to his paws. He turned to the dwarf, grunting out several questions. Evan nodded. "Sorry, man. I haven't seen him, but we can help you look for him later. First, we gotta rescue Varen." More grunting. "As far as we can tell, Elias kidnapped him. We just escaped, and now we have to find them before all these Brotherhood wackos do." Barry bristled, a low growl rolling past his yellowed teeth. If the king was here, then that meant so too was his twin, and they had taken his best friend. He turned, sniffing at the boy again. He wouldn't be able to track Atlas with this boy in the city, but moving to the bag at his side, he caught a whiff of the prince's scent from a book within. He sat back on his haunches, inhaling the dusty air around him. He could smell it, faint as it was, but he could follow it. He nodded to the tiny merc, grunting several times as he lowered himself back to all fours and pointed towards the end of the alleyway. Evan blinked.
Seriously? Sweet! Everybody, climb on! Barry's gonna take us the rest of the way. Ignoring that you can somehow speak bear, don't you think it would be a bit easy to spot us riding on him?
Piper wasn't sure this was the best addition to their plan of search and rescue. Evan shrugged.
Yeah, but who would be dumb enough to try and stop us?
With a heavy sigh, she caved and grabbed a fistful of fur. He had a point, and at least it wasn't a dragon this time. In the middle of a busy cobblestone street, an electric line of blue crackled downwards until it touched the ground. It then ripped open into a swirling vortex. Vel gracelessly stumbled out of the gateway, clutching a large parchment in one hand, the other pressed against his mouth lest he lose his dinner. He turned to help the others out when he was nearly bowled over by the dryad toppling out of the gate, landing on top of him and sending the two of them to the ground. Pyra nearly tripped over the pair as she was the last to exit. She let out a small burp and pushed her hand against her stomach, hoping to settle it some. How did realm travelers deal with such a nauseating experience? She frowned as she was nearly jostled out of the way by a group of harried-looking workers.
Where are we now?
The dense foot traffic around them took little notice of their arrival, other than to give it a wide berth, accompanied by a few grumbles about portals being right in the way. The novelty of these occurrences had quickly worn off, and now the denizens of this area only saw them as a nuisance. She followed the path of the workers until her eyes moved up the crumbling remnants of a great floating city, and a chilling black and gold banner flapped into her view. Vel, hoisted to his feet by the dryad, bent over, gripping his own knees as he held back a dry heave. The world was spinning too fast beneath his feet. It took him a moment to catch his breath. Still, without Amy's constant glitching, this trip was much less vomit-inducing. Barely. He straightened up to see that they were standing in the main street of Avis. It was the lifeblood of the city, as people, soldiers, and robed figures moved about their day around them. No one even paid them the slightest ounce of mind, as though they had always been there and hadn't just appeared from a portal.
This is Avis.
He spun on his heel, taking in the thin columns of smoke rising into the air, the faint sound of an emergency siren still ringing out from the college.
It's where I was living before all this.
He grimaced, squinting at a dark shape barely visible in the distance.
And I assume that is your tower?
Lifting the paper in his hand, Vel scrutinized that demon's horrible handwriting. They had made 3 jumps since leaving Oxhand, the first one sending them into the far north, to the river's frozen origins. It took him 2 more tries to finally discern the imp's chicken scratch. He growled as he folded the sheet of paper and tucked it into a pocket. He'd have to remember to thank that little jerk later. Undine felt naked without her halberd, but her fingers tapped nervously at the pommel of the borrowed sword at her hip. Her eyes scanned through the crowds, searching for a threat, but she saw only the same expression, be it on the face of a wealthy, finely dressed man, the exhausted soldiers, or the poor mother trying to beg for a coin. Grief. Their homes had been plucked from the world they knew and dropped into a foreign nation, and they had no knowledge as to why. It was too difficult to see such pained expressions of loss and not be able to do anything about it. Undine shot a look over to the cyborg.
How do we find your children?
Well, they're not really my kids.
His face grew hot as it flushed with color. He realized he had been calling them his kids for some time, and how misleading that could be. Truth was, Piper was like the little sister he had never had, and Atticus was that lost, rambunctious puppy that ran amok and destroyed everything he got his hands on. He chuckled a little as he scratched at the back of his neck. He really had acquired an odd sort of family. Her jaw tightened as Undine took note of multiple soldiers surging down the street past them. She shifted her stance, moving in front of Pyra as the sound of marching boots pushing their way through irate crowds grew closer. "Something is going on. I suggest we get off the street." Spinning around in the direction the Dryad was looking, Vel could see the citizens of Avis parting for a large formation of soldiers. Most of them were wearing familiar suits of red, but there were others in robes of black and gold, and near the front, a smile broke over his face.
"We're fine."
He'd recognize that pair of platinum blonde heads anywhere. He put on a look of mock outrage as he moved to greet them.
"I'm back for 5 minutes, and you welcome me home with an entire army?"
Chester, lost in thought, pulled to a stunned halt at the sound of that familiar, gravelly voice. His daughter bumped into him, and he barely heard her shout commands over her shoulder at the troops as the disbelief ran through him. "Vel?" He extended his mechanical hand with a crooked smile, but the Prime Minister snatched him up and pulled him into a tight hug. Awkward as ever, Vel attempted to shy away from the unwanted attention, but he couldn't wriggle free.
"Oh, thank the scholar you're alive!"
Chester held his grip for a moment more before he relinquished the cyborg.
"My men thought they saw the prince, but it must have been you. Where have you been? And,
He took in the disheveled, filthy, and slightly bloody state of the other man.
"Gods, you look terrible." "Thanks."
Vel's mouth formed a line as he rolled his eyes. He gave Danny a nod when she stepped around her father.
"It's a long story that I'll regale you with later. Here, let me introduce you to my friends. This is,
He spun to gesture at the Queen, but he saw Pyra practically cowering behind Undine. The Dryad had a firm grip on the handle of her still-sheathed sword, but looked ready to launch an attack at any moment. He realized why, as a long shadow fell over them, and Vel turned to see a figure he hadn't noticed before. Amid the robed warriors that he now knew to be the Brotherhood was a towering man, clothed in simple black vestments, but wore a mask of pure gold. He took a step back. The face had no eye holes, but Vel felt like his very soul was being searched, scanned, and studied. The figure paid the others no mind, staring intently at him. His attention was pulled away as a woman bounded up beside him, her long, ringlet hair bouncing against the shoulders of her ridiculously impractical battle gown. She made a gasp, the smile on her face widening as she gripped the robes of a mousy man with a heavily bandaged nose and hauled him in to whisper into his ear. With barely a stifled giggle, Charles Brightworth folded his arms in front of himself and gave their new company a short bow. "Miss Ruby greets you, Queen Pyra and Lady Undine. Our sincerest condolences on the recent loss of your homeland." Vel felt the two women bristle at his side, but he put out a hand, turning a frown on that mousy man.
"Do we have a problem here?"
Of course not, of course not." Charles smiled, gesturing with a wave towards the scholar. "The Prime Minister is working with the Enlightened One to set things straight, but those two are technically war criminals, same as the prince. I would—"
"War criminals?"
Vel wasn't sure if it was the continued stare of the golden-masked man, or the simpering tone of that weasel that set his blood on fire, but he took a step forward.
Touch them, and I'll show you a war crime.
No! Chester didn't even look at Charles as he put out a hand to stay the cyborg.
Consider them under my protection for now.
He turned his attention to Vel.
We have bigger issues at hand. The kids, don't worry about it. They should be fine. They're only several days' journey from here, headed in this direction. I just need a few supplies, and then I'm headed out to find them.
Danny shook her head. They arrived days ago.
They what?
Vel blinked.
How?
Percival. Vel let out a long sigh, rolling his eyes as he grumbled.
Percival.
Wait, did he say prince? Pyra stepped forward. As in Verin. What happened to him? Chester lowered his gaze as his shoulders slumped.
It's all my fault.
Out of all the responses Vel was expecting, this was a new emotion he wasn't used to seeing from the Prime Minister. It was one he himself was accustomed to, regret. He grabbed the man on the shoulder, giving it a slight shake.
What happened? What did you do?
I made a choice, and in my haste to make it, I didn't realize it was the wrong one. Chester kept his gaze on the street. Danny stepped forward, putting her hand on the cyborg's arm and picking up where her father could not. In an attempt to save the citizens of Avis, a plan was put into motion, but it failed, and now the prince is missing. We believe him to be alive and in the company of your brother and Elias. Reports indicate them to be headed east, near the river. They may be trying to cross to seek aid or shelter.
And the kids?
Vel felt the blood drain from his face.
What do they have to do with any of this?
Likely trying to rescue Prince Verin. The Prime Minister looked up at last, but could barely lock eyes with his friend. I tried to stop them, but...
Damn it, Chester!
Vel couldn't control himself any longer and pulled back, socking the man in his gut.
They're headed right for Elias!
He spun on his heel and started running.
Lead with that next time!
The scholar continued his unceasing stare as he watched the mechanical man dissolve into the faceless throngs of people. The Queen and her guardian soon followed, with the Prime Minister and his daughter right on their heels. The soldiers continued their march until only he, the Jewel, and her speaker remained.
An unexpected encounter.
The scholar turned his golden visage on the woman.
If that man meets with Elias, catastrophe could befall this entire world. We need to move to Phase 3 immediately.
We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded.
All right, men. They couldn't have gotten far. Find them or the Prime Minister will have our hides. Marvin, you go that way. Skinner, you're with me.
Sir, do you hear something?
My word.
Right, oogly moogly.
Skinner, was that a...
Yes, sir.
And on its back, were those...
Yes, sir.
Huh. All right, Skinner. You spotted it first. You get to arrest it.
Say what? Did I ever mention I'm allergic to bears?